theme of Bristol Tech Festival this year is changing the face of tech. And that's because technology, unfortunately, is dominated by a particular demographic of person. And today I want to talk about not only why it's absolutely crucial to diversify the tech industry, but also specifically how we can do that. We hear a lot about the problems, but we don't necessarily hear real, tangible, actionable strategies that are proven by evidence, by studies, to be effective solutions. So that's what I'll be dedicating the second half of the talk to. Now, I want to be very clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion in tech is not just about the gender gap. It's about inclusion for everyone. So in particular, Black, Asian, and people of ethnic minorities, people who are any people of color, people with disabilities, people who are of marginalized gender, LGBTQ people, people who are neurodivergent, or people with different socioeconomic and educational backgrounds who don't necessarily come from a computing background. All of those things are diversity, equity, and inclusion. But in particular today, I'm going to be focusing on the gender gap. I just want to emphasize that's not the only thing to be thinking about when it comes to diversity. I also want to be clear that when I use the term woman in this talk, I'm using an inclusive definition of the word woman. So of course that includes not only cisgendered women such as myself and trans women, but also femme-identifying genderqueer and non-binary people. Because anyone who presents femme, no matter their gender, will experience a lot of the obstacles that will come up during this talk. So with all that said, I want to start with a story. And this is the story of two people called Marty and Nicole. It's a true story. They're both reporters that live in New York. And Marty and Nicole have the same job, they work for the same person, and they share the same email inbox. And Nicole didn't produce as many reports as Marty. Marty was a nice guy. He assumed that it was because she was just less experienced. But Nicole's boss had a problem with it. And Marty was generally very successful, got on well with clients, but one day he was having a lot of trouble with the client. This client was second guessing all of his decisions, was questioning him and not signing off on the report. And then he realized he was signing off his emails as Nicole. So Marty and Nicole came up with an experiment. For 2 weeks, they decided to swap signatures. And the results were astonishing. Nicole had exemplary performance, better than she'd ever had before. She closed a record number of reports. She was producing work of a high quality. Marty called it the fortnight from hell. People were questioning him, being derisive. One client actually asked him if he was single. So they took those results to their boss to show that ultimately Nicole was struggling because she had two jobs. She first had to convince the client to respect her and trust her before she got on with the work. Whereas for Marty, that came by default, and he could just focus on the work at hand. Now, Marty and Nicole don't work in tech, but many of you may resonate with that story or know others who do. And unfortunately, this is a common obstacle that women and femme people face, not only in journalism or science, but also in technology. So today I want to explain how we can resolve that. My name is Antonia Forster. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior XR technical specialist for a company called Unity Technologies. XR is a big umbrella term and it covers virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR. So I specialize in using those technologies and also educating others to get them into the tech sector and creating webinars and educational content to empower other people to do the same. My talk today will be divided into 4 parts. First of all, what's the state of the situation right now? How bad is the gender gap? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? Is it really a problem? Is it actually your problem? And what happens if we don't do anything about it? What are the consequences of it? Secondly, I want to look at how this plays out in day-to-day interactions. So I'll show 4 types of implicit bias and what this looks like day-to-day. Then we'll be looking at the solutions. I divided these into recruitment and retention, how to find and recruit and get diverse candidates into your workplace, and then how to retain them and help them flourish and grow. If you're not in a position of decision-making or hiring or a managerial position, that's completely fine because a lot of these strategies are something we can all do to make an inclusive workplace. It's about the language we use and the environments that we build. Now, before I get into that, I want to explain my own story, because although I rely on data and statistics for my talks, I think it's important to recognize where we come from, because we do all view the world through the lens of our own experience. I also hope that if anyone here is not in tech or is maybe tech adjacent and wants to get into it, my story can serve as an example of one way in, albeit very much not a traditional one. By the end of the talk, I'll give you 2 words and 3 keys that will help you unlock the ability to build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. So I don't have a computer science background. I graduated from the University of Bristol with a zoology degree in animal behavior. And I started out working in research laboratories, so that is me in my bee suit, that is what I used to do. I studied ants and bees specifically. Eventually, I moved out of scientific research into science communication. I started working in zoos and science centres. I worked in Bristol Zoo and also We the Curious, the science centre and the planetarium there. And science communication, interestingly, actually a female-dominated field as opposed to research, which tends to be male-dominated. I had the great privilege of presenting at schools, festivals, museums, a number of different institutions. And then one talk changed my life forever. In 2017, I was invited to speak at TEDx Bristol. TEDx Bristol is the largest TED event in Europe. There are 2,000 people. It takes place in what was previously Colston Hall and is now the Bristol Beacon. And for anyone who doesn't know, TED Talks are educational, inspiring talks. So mine was on LGBTQ in the animal kingdom, which is a subject very close to my heart, not only because my background is in biology, but I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community myself. I was very, very nervous about giving this talk, not because of the audience, although there were a lot of people, but because I wasn't actually out of the closet to my family at the time. And I thought it was very important, as part of that talk, to be clear about who I am, that I belong to that community. So before giving that talk, I decided to come out of the closet, and it did not go very well at all. Unfortunately, some of my family members responded with threats of violence, blackmail, homophobic slurs, and even bribery. I was offered ongoing financial support, but only as long as I cancelled the talk and remained in the closet and wasn't public about my identity to anyone from that point on. So that was obviously emotionally devastating, but there was also a practical implication, because I had a very difficult decision to make. Should I go ahead with this talk? And it wasn't just about standing by my morals and doing the right thing, because if I did go ahead, I would need a practical strategy to support myself. Unfortunately, I wasn't financially independent yet at the time, because science communication is not a very lucrative career path. So I thought long and hard about it, and in the end I decided I would go ahead with the talk and see the consequences through. And a number of things happened as a result. First of all, many positive consequences. It went down really well with the audience and online. It's reached 150,000 views now and counting. I was invited to deliver the talk at schools and a number of different institutions and help with other people's efforts in LGBTQ activism. I was nominated and shortlisted for the John Maddox Prize by the scientific journal Nature for standing up for science in the face of social adversity. And most importantly, I started receiving, I still do to this day, messages from queer people all over the world, from America to Spain to Ghana to New Zealand, saying that the talk helped them, either to come to terms with who they are, or even to explain it to their friends and family, to show that yes, LGBTQ is actually natural in the real sense of the word. But unfortunately, there were negative consequences as well. I actually had to cut contact with over half my family, and we remain separated to this day. There's been no change in their attitudes towards it. And as promised, financial support was withdrawn. So I had to think about my career and how to make it more sustainable and independent, find a way to support myself single-handedly. So I decided to learn programming. I had no previous experience, but as you can imagine, I was very motivated to learn. And there's so much free material online, so that's what I used. I started learning a program called Unity, which allows you to build games or any kind of interactive experience that you want, partly because it was free, but also because there was lots of material on YouTube and courses on Udemy, so I didn't need to spend any money on that. So I started learning it, and in particular, I was very interested in building my own worlds where I could look however I wanted and be whoever I wanted without any kind of negative repercussions. Worlds that I could occupy safely and worlds that I could build. So this led me to augmented and virtual reality. And after learning for about 6 or 9 months, a job opportunity arose. It was in a local tech company here in Bristol called Ultraleap, and it said, you need a computer science degree. So I thought, there's no way I'm gonna get it. But one of my friends encouraged me to apply anyway, and I was absolutely shocked to actually land the role. So I became a professional virtual reality developer, making hand tracking applications, where you can reach out and grab things in VR without needing any kind of controllers. You have this sense of immersion in the world. I also created touchless screens. These two on the right are ones that I actually made myself. That allows you to use a touchscreen without actually making any contact with the surface, which turned out to be really useful in a pandemic. A year later, I got a call from Unity. the company that made the software that I was using. And unbelievably, after a grueling interview process, I started working there. So that's where I work now as a senior Excel technical specialist, which combines coding with public speaking, a role that I feel extremely privileged to have. I strongly believe in the power of emerging technology, especially virtual reality, to change the world. Not just by building virtual worlds, but actually making change in the real one. So a few months ago, I completed work on the world's first LGBTQ virtual reality museum. It has 15 3D objects and audio stories from queer people here in Bristol, and 25 artworks from queer artists all over the world. It was showcased in London, and it will be available completely for free as soon as I'm available to make it available for everyone. And I'm hoping to get it exhibited in a number of venues in Bristol as well. So there's a couple of lessons there. First of all, Bristol is an incredible place for opportunities. I went from the university to the zoo, to the science centre, to the planetarium, to a tech company, to TED Talks, to building a virtual museum right here in the city without having to leave. And I don't know many places where that's true. The second lesson is that getting into tech completely changed my life. It's allowed me to live openly as a queer person in a way that I probably wouldn't be able to otherwise. It's also given me the means to give back to my community. And that's an opportunity that I really want everybody to have. So how does this relate to the experiences of other women? Surely if I made it despite the odds, then anyone can. Well, sadly, that's not actually true. My experience is very unusual, and women in tech are in the minority. So in this section, I want to explore the gender gap. How bad is it? How is it changing over time? How does it intersect with other aspects of identity? And what can we do about it? In the UK, in 2018, just 20% of the tech workforce was female. And when you look in the US, it's slightly better at 25%, but still a definite minority. When you look at actual software engineering positions, it's even worse. Women occupy just 11% of software engineering roles in the UK. And the gender gap is highly related to ethnicity. These stats are from the USA, where 25% of women, the tech workforce is 25% female, but white women occupy 16% of those roles. Asian women make up just 5%, and Black and Latina women account for just 3% and 1%, respectively. So ethnicity is highly tied in with the gender gap. We can't talk about the gender gap without talking about race and ethnicity. And in the UK, we're actually doing even worse. Black women in engineering roles make up just 0.3% of those roles in 2019, and this did rise slightly to 0.7% in 2020. So it's a dire situation. Now, many companies already know this and are actively trying to combat this, so that's the good news. Companies are very invested in it, and that makes sense because it's not just a moral imperative for obvious reasons, but diversity also pays. Both gender and ethnic diversity are positively correlated with higher profits. In 2014, UK companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to achieve above average financial returns. And in 2017, this rose to 21%. The probability of success for ethnically diverse companies is even higher at 33%. So having both gender and ethnic diversity in leadership is crucial for financial success, and that's becoming more true every year. But why? Well, one reason is the social climate. People may not want to invest in or work for companies which are entirely homogenous. For example, a study of 16,000 Gen Zs and millennials found that over half were actively looking at a company's diversity and inclusion efforts when deciding where they'd like to work. So if you don't have efforts for inclusion and diversity, you will not attract top talent from any demographic, not just from marginalized communities. But there is another more subtle reason. Diversity leads to success, particularly in tech, because of innovation. The more diversity you have in your workforce, and that means their age, their gender, their orientation, their ethnicity, their cultural experiences, their background, the more different ways you have of looking at a problem, the more different ways you'll approach it, and the more novel solutions you'll find, and the better you can innovate. And particularly in tech, innovation really is the key to success. And if we don't hire diverse teams, there can be some embarrassing and worrying consequences, particularly in fields like AI and machine learning, where we can unknowingly reproduce our own biases in algorithms. So broadly, there's two types of sexism in AI and machine learning. The first is where machine learning algorithms or AI itself makes sexist decisions, makes biased decisions about groups of people. One example is Amazon's AI recruitment software, which they used to use in the early stages of looking through CVs. To train it on what a good CV looks like, they compared it to an existing successful hire, which sort of makes sense. But the problem is that most of the successful hires for software engineering roles were men. So the algorithm picked up on this and started actively penalizing CVs which had the word women or girls, like women's chess club or all girls school. The second type of sexism or prejudice in AI and machine learning is a lot more insidious. It's about how the products we use and interact with reinforce our own gendered beliefs. So think about voice assistant technology, like Google Home or Siri or Alexa. By default, typically these technologies have female voices. And that's because consumer research shows that people are more comfortable having a servile robot when it has a female voice. But that wasn't always the case. The first voice assistant technology to become popular was driving instructor software, like TomToms. And those typically had a male voice by default, because research showed that people were more comfortable taking instructions from a male voice than from a female one. So using diverse data sets, having diverse consumers, and most importantly, having diverse teams and decision makers is crucial to avoid these kinds of problems. So you may be actively trying to recruit more women and more people from marginalized communities, but you just find that they're not applying for the roles. Why is that, and what can be done? Well, the reason is that the gender gap doesn't just start in the industry. It starts much earlier, and it's globally true. So when you look at the whole world, women are 25% less likely than men to have simple digital literacy skills, things like manipulating data in a spreadsheet. And the more you look up areas of expertise, the more the gender gap widens. When you look at computer science and engineering students, just 19% of graduates in those fields are female. Once we look at the workforce, this drops to 11%. When you look at published mobile apps, just 6% of these on the market are created by women. And when you get to the very edges of technology, the real emerging research pushing the edge of our knowledge, the gender gap becomes a chasm. 88% of patents in tech are filed by all male teams, and only 2% are filed by all female teams. Recruiters in Silicon Valley say that for roles in machine learning and AI and any emerging technology, often only 1% of the applicants are women. So why does this happen? You may think that women are naturally, biologically, just less interested in computing and in programming. Well, if that was the case, it would have always been true historically. And when we look at history, we can see that it's not. Computer used to be a job title, a mathematician. And in 1943, the majority of human computers were women. In the 1940s, electronic computers were invented and introduced and were mostly used in the war effort for code breaking and encryption. And at Bletchley Park, the British hub of code breaking, 75% of the programmers there were women. This is a picture of NASA's computers in the 1950s. 10 years later, men landed on the moon. And Margaret Hamilton was the woman that led the team who programmed the Apollo guidance computer that landed them there. She helped to coin the term software engineer to describe what she did. But the term wasn't taken seriously at the time because software was seen as soft, not a serious discipline like hardware engineering or science. Programming was seen as clerical, secretarial work, and women were deemed very suitable for it, given the stereotype of them being obedient, meticulous, tidy, and good at following instructions. And ironically, those same stereotypes later served to push women out of computing when it became a powerful and a lucrative discipline. So when precisely did that happen? Was it gradual or was it sudden? Well, the answer is surprising. It happened in 1985. In the mid-1980s, the number of women enrolling in computing courses dropped dramatically. And as a comparison, we don't see that same drop in things like medicine or law or physical sciences, which are also very demanding. So it's specific to computing. But why? Well, there are a number of theories, but one of the leading ones is that this coincides with the introduction of personal computers into the home. And as was typical in the 80s, these were marketed in a gendered way in order to sell more units. These were marketed as boys' toys. So sons were twice as likely to be bought a computer compared to daughters. Shared computers were placed into a boy's room rather than a girl's. Fathers were more likely to purchase them than mothers, and much more likely to spend time with their son using a computer than with their daughter. At the same time, competition and popularity for computing courses exploded, and women were at a disadvantage because they didn't have this early childhood experience. Then the media started portraying programmers as mostly male, and that really cemented the stereotype. So if this happened in 1985, why is it still happening today? The sad fact is that it's actually getting worse. In the last decade, the number of women in software engineering roles is decreasing, even though the demand for those roles is increasing rapidly. 10 years ago, women occupied 15% of software developer roles in the UK, and now we occupy just 11%. So what are the mechanisms causing this inequality? Well, that's what I want to look at now. We all have implicit bias, and it affects all of our day-to-day interactions in a number of ways. So I'm going to show just 4 examples. It's important to understand that all of us, doesn't matter our gender, our ethnicity, or background, we all have implicit bias. It's a result of the way the human brain works. We're surrounded by a wealth of complex information, and we can't take it all in, so we have to simplify it. And to do that, we use schemas, simple mental constructs, in order to recognize things without much effort. So your schema for what a car is might be that it has 4 wheels, it's a certain size, it's probably a certain shape. And schemas are quite useful because it allows you to recognize things quickly. In the case of a car, to not get run over. We rely on schemas more when we're under stress or we're in a hurry. But the problem is that schemas lead to stereotyping. Because if the majority of CEOs that you've seen are male, then your idea or schema of what a CEO looks like and acts like probably lean towards masculine characteristics. Implicit bias affects our day-to-day interactions in many ways, and one of those ways is micro-inequities. These are small, repetitive, cumulative negative interactions that make someone feel as if they don't belong and negatively impact that person's performance. Now, we all experience micro-inequities, as we're about to see, but these are disproportionately experienced by marginalized people, particularly women, and particularly people who are black or brown people of color. So we're going to play a game of micro-inequity bingo. I'm going to bring up a bingo card, have a look and see if you've experienced or maybe seen in your workplace any of the things on the card. If you get 3 across, down, or in a diagonal, you've got bingo. Just shoot your hand up in the air if you do. So here's micro-inequity bingo. If you've ever heard someone say he to describe a candidate who hasn't been hired yet. If you've had things explained to you that you already know, the very popular mansplaining. But it's still a micro-inequity no matter who's doing it to you. People are assuming you don't know things you actually have expertise in. If you're being asked to take care of office housework, things like organizing social events or taking notes when it's not actually your job. If you have your name mispronounced frequently, have your ideas ignored until they're repeated by others. If you have colleagues looking at the clock or checking their watch or their phone while you speak. If you're consistently confused with other people belonging to your demographic at the company. If you're asked to do diversity work and you're not actually paid for it, and again, it's not actually part of your job, and if you don't feel able to speak about your personal life, this can particularly affect queer people. So I personally do have bingo on this. I don't know if anyone else does. I can see quite a few hands going up. Mostly the femme presenting people in the room, so that's interesting. So I do this at organizations, and I do want to make a note that if you do this in your organization and you don't get anyone who's experienced it, that could be a good thing. Could be there's no micro-inequities, or it could be that you're lacking diversity somewhat within the group because these are experienced by marginalized people. If you get a group of people who aren't marginalized in any way, they might not experience these things. So could be a good sign, could also be a bad sign, something to bear in mind. Next, I want to talk about the phenomenon of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the idea, whether it's real or imagined, that you belong to some negative stereotype about your group. That causes your cortisol levels to rise, your pupils dilate, your blood sugar drops, your heart rate rises, and the amount of mental load or cognitive capacity you have to focus on the task is reduced. and so your performance will suffer. This is a very well-known phenomenon. There are over 300 published studies of stereotype threat. One of the most well-studied examples is girls taking maths tests. Now, the stereotype that girls are not as good as maths as boys are is not actually true, but it does affect children from a very early age. If you put a girl in a room full of boys and you give her a maths test, she will perform worse than if you put her in a room with multiple girls. And this has been shown many, many times over. The results, the performance gap, is proportional to the number of girls or women in the room. And it's not the only thing that causes stereotype threat. You can also make it worse by telling her you expect to see a difference, that boys typically perform better than girls in these kinds of questions, and you'll elicit that gap. Environmental cues can also have an impact. So things like science fiction posters, video games, comic books and stacks of soda cans, stereotypically geeky items, seem to also elicit this gap in performance and increase stereotype threat. So how do you get rid of it? Well, it's very simple. You just put the stereotype out of people's minds. For example, if you tell the students that you don't expect to see a difference between the genders on these kinds of questions, you typically won't see one. If you make sure the room itself is diverse in terms of gender, if you replace the decor with neutral things like plants or pictures of nature and bottles of water, you won't see that gap. Stereotype threat doesn't just affect girls or women in mostly male environments. It also affects people of color in predominantly white environments, and also people from deprived socioeconomic backgrounds when they're surrounded by symbols of wealth. Stereotype threat is an example of why you can't just judge by results without considering the context that those results were achieved in. Next, I want to touch on tokenism and the glass cliff. Tokenism is where an employer hires a small number of people from a marginalized group and then expects them to represent everyone in that demographic. For example, a black woman may be asked how the product appeals to all women, or about diversity and inclusion efforts for all black people in the organization. But we would rarely expect one man to speak for all men, or one white person to speak for all white people. Another problem with tokenism is that having a small number of people from a marginalized community can make them feel a lot of pressure to perform, and often pressure to take on unpaid diversity work, which can negatively affect their performance, especially in a technical role. The glass cliff is related. It's where someone who's marginalized is thrust into a position too early, or given responsibilities they don't actually have the authority or the training for, and so they're set up to fail. Sometimes this can be done in goodwill or good faith because of pressure to meet diversity targets, but ultimately it's harmful to that person, to the organization, and to diversity efforts at large. Finally, I want to talk about gender and color invisibility. So sometimes people say, I don't care what gender you are, as long as you get the work done. Or, I don't see color, I just see your results. And that would be appropriate if the whole world thought that way. And I can see that it's maybe well-meaning. But in reality, that ignores the struggles and the context that that person is working in. I've heard it phrased like this: if you don't see color or gender or any marginalized status, then you don't see patterns. Stereotype threat or bias, think of the story of Marty and Nicole, show why you can't just judge by results without understanding their context. Because bias affects our ability to perform and our ability to achieve those results. It's crucial to understand someone's context, their background, their environment, and also to collect data to see where the inequity is in your organization. So one example of this is the pay gap. We have a lot of data on the gender pay gap, but there's very little on the racial pay gap because we don't typically collect that data and because the sample sizes are smaller. Because there's a lack of data, there's a lack of awareness. 67% of women agree that there is a gender pay gap, but only 39% of women agree that there is a racial pay gap. And that discrepancy is particularly pronounced in white women. Maybe that's unsurprising because we understand the struggles we face as women. We've experienced sexism, we've seen it with our own eyes. But maybe if we're a white person, we don't understand the obstacles we haven't faced. We don't see the racism and the micro-inequities in that way in the workplace. Despite the lack of awareness, evidence shows that there is both a gender and a racial pay gap. In tech, there's a 25% pay gap. That means women working in tech on average are paid 25% less than men. The pay gap across all industry in the UK is 18%. So tech actually has more inequity than the industry on average. Now, that doesn't mean that men and women in the same roles are paid differently, although unfortunately that's also true. If you match men and women in the same industry, in the same levels of seniority, women earn 3% less than men. But the 25% figure comes from the fact that women are underrepresented in senior positions, particularly positions of power. Just 13% of executive roles are occupied by women. Unfortunately, there's very little data on the intersection of the gender gap and the racial pay gap, and that's particularly in tech. Partly because there are so few women of color working in the industry, the sample sizes would be impractically small to conduct any kind of study. But there are studies looking across all industries, and they show that white women in full-time, year-round work earn more than black women in the same circumstances. So we can see that both these gaps do exist. Which brings us to the solutions. We now understand some of the mechanisms that perpetuate this inequality, so how do we fix it? I've divided the solutions into recruitment and retention, but we can all do things to help make our workplaces more equitable. I'm going to speed through these, but I will give you some resources at the end so you can explore every point in detail. First of all, how do you source your candidates? If you rely on elite universities, word of mouth, or maybe poaching from other tech companies, you're going to select for a privileged subset of particular people. And referrals especially reinforce the status quo. 64% of people recommend candidates who are the same gender as them. And 72% of people recommend candidates who are the same race or ethnicity as them. This isn't necessarily explicit sexism or racism, although it might be, but it just is the fact that those are the people we know. They're the people in our phone book. So if you have a diverse organization, this is great, because it will reinforce the diversity. But if you don't, unfortunately it won't. It will just reinforce the status quo. So look in diverse sources when you are advertising a job or networking or recruiting candidates. Once you've found those sources, use inclusive language. Research shows that women are more likely to apply for a job when it uses the words dependable, understanding, teamwork, cooperation, commitment. And they're less likely to apply for a job, as are many men, when it uses the word lead, active, confident, and competitive. Marginalized people typically don't think of themselves in that way, particularly with women because of the way we're socialized. So if you do want to attract more diverse candidates, emphasize teamwork and collaboration rather than competition. Also, language like best of the best, 10x developer, ninja, wizard, rock star, as well as being a bit ridiculous, tends to put off anyone who comes from a prejudiced or marginalized community because they've been trained not to think of themselves that way, even when they actually have a great deal of expertise. Women are also less likely than men to apply for jobs unless they meet all of the criteria. I wouldn't be here speaking with you today, most likely, if I'd done that. The job said I needed a computer science degree, that it was required, and I didn't have one, so why bother? But I took my friend's advice, who was male, did apply and did get the job. So it's so important to be honest about what actually is required. Does the candidate need a computer science degree, or could they maybe learn on the job? You can add a desired group to be more honest about qualifications. Also, all people are more likely to be invested in their job if they can see the meaning and the purpose of the role. So show how it gives back to the community, how it solves a problem, how it changes the world, how it makes a difference. And you'll have more people applying and people more engaged and more happy in their role. Research on resumes and CVs shows that this stage of applications is particularly prone to bias. A resume with a white-sounding name will get 50% more callbacks than the same resume with a black-sounding name. And the same is true with female names and identical resumes with male names. So you may think, let's just erase the names and that will get rid of the problem. But the issue there is what we touched on earlier with gender and color invisibility. People who are marginalized are less likely to have certain experiences like access to cutting-edge technology or a degree from an elite university, just because of the privilege and the income that requires. Instead, assess candidates on the basis of their potential. Victoria Alonso is the Senior VP at Marvel. In a male-dominated industry, she actually has a gender equitable team. And the way she phrases it is this: just because someone doesn't have something on their CV, it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means they haven't been given the opportunity. Also, marginalized candidates will have lots of skills that you probably wouldn't put on your CV, but stand you in very good stead for a career in tech. Things like patience, resilience, determination, problem solving, and lateral thinking. Finally, look at the environmental cues around you, your office space. As we mentioned earlier, things like comic book references, video games, science fiction posters, and stacks of soda cans may make anyone feel they don't belong if they don't fit that sort of geeky stereotype. This is hard for me to say because I am a geek, I love video games, but I do recognize the data says that that's not inclusive decor. Try and use things that are more neutral, or a diversity of different things. Have a diversity of different social engagements. Maybe don't always go to the pub or rock climbing, which seems to be the really popular thing in tech. Also, when you're assessing candidates, think about the actual panel interviewing them, because that is an environmental cue. If you don't have diverse people interviewing that candidate in the room and they don't fit into that group, it can negatively affect their performance and how you think about their potential and their fit in the role. Also, be very wary of phrases like culture fit. What do we actually mean by that? Rather than considering whether someone will assimilate into the current culture, consider whether they might bring a fresh perspective and new views and different cultural experiences that might help the team innovate. So I've arranged these into a handy mnemonic called HIRE, which I made myself. You can think about how you diverse candidates, consider inclusive language, resume bias, and environmental cues. But there's also a key to unlock the success of these practices, and that is data. Collecting data before and after you make a change, for example, when you change the language on your job adverts, will help you to see what is most effective for your organization. And don't just collect data if you can on hires, also collect them on applicants, because that's really helpful to know. Without data, you won't know what works best. Now I want to tackle the solutions to help people stay in the organization, grow and flourish and find success. Firstly, cultivate a growth mindset. The opposite of a growth mindset is a fixed mindset, the idea that skill is innate, you're born with it or you're not. And that makes no sense in tech because nobody is born with these skills. If anyone here is thinking about learning programming, I urge you to try it. It's not like math, it's more like learning Spanish. It's a language. I think there's a lot of negative disbelief around it. In fact, programmers are not hired to know things, really. We're hired to find things out. We're really good at Googling, basically. So encourage a growth mindset and make it very clear to your staff that it's okay to ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Assign them an onboarding buddy to whom they can ask anything confidentially, whether it's technical or about the company. And that really helps people to onboard faster. Move fast and break things is the phrase, but marginalized people may feel less free to do that. Secondly, raise awareness of processes. Things like filing patents. We saw earlier that women file many fewer patents than men, and part of that is the process is not transparent. Marginalized people have less access to word-of-mouth information that people in majority groups do. So don't rely on that. Make a document, make a committee, make the process for promotion and growth within the company transparent, and that will give everyone opportunities to access it. Next, in performance reviews in particular, offer specific feedback and avoid vague or personality criticism. A study of 250 appraisals across 25 companies found that the word abrasive appeared in 17 different women's appraisals and exactly 0 men's appraisals. Because women are socialized to behave a certain way and we expect that behavior, they're more likely to be penalized if they don't fit into that stereotype. Women are 3 times more likely than men to be told their communication style is too aggressive, while men are twice as likely to receive technical feedback on vision and technical experience that they should gain in order to progress. That is the valuable feedback. That is specific and actionable and helps people grow. That's related to my last point about transparency. Have a transparent growth process and give people feedback on how they fit that, not on their personality. If you really want a diverse workplace, make that part of the performance criteria. What gets rewarded is what gets done. Give people the time and the incentive to actually engage in diversity and inclusion efforts. Next, ensure tasks are assigned fairly across your team. Tanya Riley is the principal software engineer at Squarespace, and she came up with a great term, which is glue work. Glue work is work that's very important for the cohesion and success of a team, but it's not often recognized or promoted. Things like chairing and taking notes in meetings, onboarding new starters, writing up documentation, maybe setting code standards. Those things aren't as promotable in a tech company as actually pushing out code. Women are 48% more likely to volunteer for glue work, and 44% more likely to be volunteered by their manager, which ultimately harms their career in the long run. So rather than relying on volunteers, though that may seem fair, distribute the tasks evenly and encourage marginalized candidates to try stretch goals and assignments that maybe they would be too nervous to try without their manager's encouragement. Finally, set up mentors and sponsors. To be clear about the difference here, a mentor is someone in a senior position who helps someone in a more junior position navigate the unwritten rules of the company. They give advice, they help with networking, and they boost their mentees' confidence. Sponsors are slightly different. They vouch for someone. They put them forward for promotions, for jobs. They believe in them. So having mentors and sponsors available for everybody is crucial, but this will particularly help people who are of marginalized status, who won't necessarily be confident enough to vouch for themselves. Once again, I made a handy mnemonic, which is the word growth. Have a growth mindset, raise awareness, offer specific feedback, reward diversity work, make sure tasks are assigned fairly, and have sponsors and mentors. Again, there's a key to success, and that is training managers. People don't leave jobs, they leave managers. Managers have the ability to exacerbate or to fix many of the problems that any marginalized person is facing in the workplace. But they need the resources, the time, and the incentive to really be invested in their employees' growth and success. The final key is senior leadership. You need to enlist help from leadership because they have the authority and the ability to actually enforce and make these kinds of decisions. One study of 700 companies found that recruiting help from leadership and holding them accountable for diversity targets was the single most effective intervention. It raised the number of white women in leadership positions by 19%, black women by 27%, and black men by 12%. So if you remember just 3 things from this talk, make it the 3 keys of success. Collect data, train your managers, and make sure you get the help and the investment of senior leadership. I started with a story and I want to finish with one. This is a story of Abraham Wald, a mathematician. And in World War II, the American military enlisted Wald to help with reinforcing planes in the most effective way. If a plane has too much reinforcement, it's too heavy to fly, but too little, and it'll be shot down. So they needed to figure out where they should reinforce. This is an image of a plane that returned back from combat, and the red dots are where the bullet holes were. It was mostly shot in the body, the tail, and in the wings. So the military said, okay, those are the areas to reinforce. But Wald realized something much more profound. They should not reinforce those areas. They should reinforce the other areas, the cockpit and the engines. Why? Because the planes being shot there didn't come back. This is something called survivorship bias. So what's the relevance to this talk? Well, I'm a plane with bullet holes in the wings. The fact that I'm even in tech indicates that despite the obstacles I faced, I made it. And that's why I rely on data and statistics and studies for my talks, instead of just telling my own experiences. Because I'm a cisgendered, white woman from a middle-class background. I have no physical disabilities, and English is my first language. That gives me a huge number of privileges. Yes, I've experienced my own obstacles, for sure. But those that I haven't experienced, things like transphobia, racism, disability discrimination, class discrimination, will stop a huge number of people entering the industry. So I want to urge you, don't just ask marginalized people who are in tech what needs to be done. also ask the marginalized people who are not in tech, but would like to be. Finally, I'll leave you with these resources. This is where I collect my data from. NCWIT in particular have a huge number of resources and information packs to help you. So please Google that and you can find a ton of resources to actually implement all of these strategies in your workplace. The road to gender equality, to diversity, equity, and inclusion is a long one. This is just the first step on a long journey. But it's incredibly exciting. It's immensely important. And I really believe that we here in Bristol, more than anyone, will actually be able to achieve it. Thank you so much.